know what we're fighting for.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome into Podcast by George. Well, we're doing the podcast today. It's Martin Luther King Day, and I couldn't be happier to have a returnee to the podcast, an old buddy, an old friend out in NYC. It's Nicholas Powers. And you may recall from my earlier podcast, he's the author of The Ground Below Zero, 9/11 to Burning Man, New Orleans to Darfur, Haiti to Occupy Wall Street, published by Upset Press. He's also writing all over the internet, and he's an associate professor of English at the State University of New York, Old Westbury. Nicholas Powers, welcome back to a podcast by George.
Hey, good morning, George. I know it's really early for you, so thanks for waking up.
Well, I'm an old farm boy, so I can handle that. I'm used to it, Nick. Well, I wanted to, maybe get started here. The timeliness, the topical item, obviously, is the insurgency, the riots. I don't know what you want to call it. The rebel yell in Washington, D.C. Now, you're a progressive like I am, looking at this maybe from the left side of the political spectrum. What was your take on everything that's transpired thus far?
I wasn't surprised.
Yeah. Reminds me of, I always think of Malcolm X. He got a lot of heat for it, but they went and interviewed him after JFK was assassinated. And he said, well, the chickens have come home to roost. And people said, wow, man, that's heavy. I mean, that's not the kind of thing you say right now. But it was true. And I understand that perspective.
I wasn't surprised. Over the past couple of years, the president has stoked constant accusations and boogeymen and shadowy cabals in the deep corners of the state that were going to steal the election away from him, because God forbid he could ever lose anything. And so, he'd been stoking like someone over a campfire, just stoking the coals of rage, and then eventually pouring gasoline on the coals and then feeding it more. And so I'm not surprised that it exploded. And, and he was there on the podium saying, Giuliani was saying, trial by combat, and Trump was, march up, the avenue. So I'm not surprised. And also I'm not surprised because the ideology, or a less fancy word, the story in the right wing that floats through the right wing media, and, whether it's the far right, which is like, either 4chan or, deep in the dark web, or the more surface parts of the media, like say Fox News, that's more on the surface. But whether they do it in vulgar terms in the deep part of the dark internet, or if they do it in more respectable terms on the surface, it's all kind of the same story. That your country's being stolen from you by people who are worth less than you, who are different from you. And they're so different that if they take control of this country that you knew and grew up in, is going to be gone forever. And so you have to defend it. And on top of that, you have really wild conspiracy theories, like there's satanic pedophiles, standing over a vat of children's blood and body parts and stewing it together, with like a copy of the Constitution, just like stewing it together. And so, if you have this kind of toxic story that people are buying into and, infusing with their most intense emotions, and then you have the president of the United States screaming that this election is getting stolen. Again, I'm not surprised because this has been part of American history. I mean, there have been constant mob attacks on democracy throughout the history of the country.
Yes.
And for the most part, the institutions have held. But there have been instances of mob attacks consistently. And there also have been, really after the Civil War and, after the era of Reconstruction, when the federal troops were pulled out of the South, you really had, whole decades in which Black Americans could not even really vote in the South. And so, and when they tried to, they were terrorized, people were raped or killed, burned on trees, families killed, churches burnt to the ground, people hit with gun butts away from the voting booths. And so, you really have this idea of American democracy has always been a struggle towards the ideal of democracy, but the reality has been much more patchwork. And so whether it's mobs, whether it's actually voter suppression, the ideal of democracy is something that we've been fighting towards, but never quite totally achieving. And so when I saw the mob attack, to me, it just brought back, so many kind of historical scenes of other mob attacks, whether it's against people trying to vote or whether it's against, minority towns, like the riots in LA, and I think the Zoot Suit riots, where like white Navy officers terrorized the Mexican neighborhoods in LA. You know, I mean, there's just constant, series of violent actions in the history of the U.S. So again, I wasn't surprised, but I have to say, I was almost kind of depressed that I wasn't surprised, because at least being shocked would have said that a sense of naivete maybe, but at least it would have maybe said that there was an expectation that democracy, an expectation that it would have been respected. And so to know that I wasn't really surprised, meant there was also maybe realism, but realism that comes at the price of a certain deflation of hope in other human beings, and specifically other Americans. Um, but the last point I maybe should say about this is that it was a failed coup attempt. It wasn't particularly organized. I mean, it was organized beforehand, but not organized enough. And it did. And were there cops on Capitol Hill, or people like, further in security forces, who kind of either opened the doors or kind of stood by? Um, it seems like it. It seems like, there was some inside help, but not enough to really allow for the insurrectionists to get into the Capitol and get their hands on some of the politicians and possibly take them hostage, maybe kill them. So we were lucky in that respect. But the other reason, and the last point, the reason I say that it's a failed coup is that, look, the security forces of the United States have basically been pretty much racially integrated now for a couple of decades. If you look at the army, it's pretty integrated. If you look at the police departments in the cities, kind of integrated in some places. When you get out to the rural landscape, not so much. The FBI, the CIA, the State Department, the state has been integrated for a long time. So the idea that there's going to be a kind of white supremacist MAGA uh, coup against the state is kind of laughable. That's not actually kind of in the cards. But what is in the cards, unfortunately, are people who are driven by a conspiracy theory or an ideology or a story that they're losing the country, to commit acts of violence. And I think that's what we really have to kind of be worried about going forward.
Well, I have to agree, and our thinking was a lot alike. The one thing that I thought along what you're just saying is that if those people had intended to spirit their guns in there and kill everybody in the room, they could have done that. They didn't. Now, people died. Some people were killed, so that's to be taken into consideration. But mostly what they wanted to do was piss in the punch bowl, and that's what they did by and large, but people died because of it. Now, the other thing that I thought of, I've mentioned it on my podcast a couple of times. I like you, when I looked at that, I was also flashing back to the victims of our society since its inception, basically. And I've tried to explain this, and I don't know if people are exactly picking up what I'm putting down, but I think of all the victims of racism, particularly in this country, since its inception that you delineated, the group that takes it upon themselves, that are so put upon that they have to take action, is this group that we saw on the television set. And I'm looking at that and going, my God, what an insult to everybody that's a legitimate victim of racism and violence in this country, that's who I'm watching on my national television crawl through the windows of the United States Capitol. Did that occur to you?
Yeah, but I grew up with those guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's like, look, I know people could, they could look online and they're like, oh, that's some Brooklyn cultural Marxist guy with that afro, blah blah blah. You know what I mean? Like so like obviously there's a stereotype box that they could check me off, but they don't really know me, right? They don't know where I grew up or where I've traveled. And the reality is I've lived in the city, and I lived in the country, and I've traveled, and I've moved with my family all up and down the Northeast, and I've traveled out west and the Midwest. And more than that, I'm a voracious listener. I'm verbose in the interviews, but in my real life, I actually shut up and I just listen because I love people's stories. And so I'm kind of this like traveling like tape recorder, and I just love hearing people's stories. And I've talked to so many people, thousands upon thousands of people in my life, homeless people at bus stops, people who are sleeping in tents in parks, random workers in kitchens and fast food restaurants, train operators, people at gambling casinos out in Nevada. I mean, everything. And so growing up, going from cities, like New York to the countrysides, whether it's in Pennsylvania or other, I grew up with those guys. I've seen them. And, you know, when it was just me with them and we were drinking some beers, yeah, would they say some off-color jokes and some weird stuff? Yeah, I would kind of give them a little weird look and they'd kind of back off a little bit. But I would just listen to them. I wouldn't judge them. I wouldn't pounce on them. I would just listen. And the thing that strikes me about that type of white guy who we saw climbing the Capitol steps and pushing the cops and trying to get in, I grew up with him. I've known him my whole life. I've known that guy. And what strikes me is that he has both in a sense of entitlement, but also a deep sense of grievance. Like he feels that things are being taken away from him, and that he looks around in the world which used to reflect him, and now he's seeing different faces. He's seeing yellow faces, black faces, Latino faces, Asian, indigenous, disabled faces, all these faces. And so the world doesn't uniformly reflect him in the way that it does. And so he feels that as a loss. Also, one thing that people don't understand about those guys is that, life wasn't really easy for them either. Like their whiteness and their maleness and their, able-bodiedness, it took them far, but not as far as many people think. A lot of those guys really didn't actually have easy lives. And the price that they paid for their success sometimes was working way too hard and missing out on family, feeling lost inside of themselves. Like they worked really hard, they got their car, they got their thing, they got their nice house, but their marriages are a wreck. The children don't know them, they don't know themselves. They know the bottom of a bottle, or they know what it's like to drive all night on a highway because they can't really go home and they don't want to face the screaming or the silence, which is sometimes worse than the screaming. I've listened to these guys' stories my whole life, and there's a kind of quiet desperation in their lives. And so, again, not to extend too much sympathy, to that type of guy who was climbing the Capitol, but I know that guy. Like I grew up with him. And, it's weird because they always have this like weird like space in their mind for like that one token friend who's different, right? And so whenever I was in their lives, even if I was just passing through, they're like, "Oh, you're a good one," And that was the way that they could keep their racism, but honor the fact that we were having a real, like man to man like connection. And and I got it. Yeah, I didn't take it personally. I knew that that's what they needed to do psychologically, and I kept it going. But I could tell that they were struggling between like, "Oh, I really like this guy," but at the same time, I have this worldview that means he's the enemy. So, I knew those guys. And so when I saw the guys climbing up the thing, I was like, those are the guys who went too far in the rabbit hole of QAnon and right-wing ideology, and they're stealing the election. And I think that they are digging themselves into a deeper and deeper hole. And I wonder if either they or anyone else will be able to bring them out of that hole.
And what's to come and where are they going to go next? And I'm glad that you put it in that context because I've described it that way too. Again, not to give them too much benefit of the doubt, but they do have legitimate complaint. They have a foundation of legitimacy. I mean, they've lost their jobs. They've lost their health care. The pandemic's been hard on everyone. Yeah. They've gone off to war or seen their friends go off to illegitimate wars and come home wounded and in body bags. And so they've got that legitimate foundation, but now they've built illegitimacy on top of that. And this craziness, like you mentioned, QAnon and things like that have resulted in where we're at today. Now, there's another guy that better than most, and that's Donald Trump, because he's from your neighborhood, kind of. I mean, he's from out there. And when we talked earlier, Nick, you were one of the strong proponents for impeaching him. He's been impeached again. They're going to have a trial in the Senate. I looked at that and I said to myself, basically with these folks that are so riled up and so militant and so well armed and so large in numbers, apparently, to what I saw in Washington, D.C., I told folks, maybe it's best to let him slide on out of there as scheduled, Donald Trump, and pursue him legally in the Southern District of New York and get him convicted and prevent him from holding office that way. And that could take a few months maybe, and these people would kind of go to sleep. But they've kind of gone on record and said they're not going to be satisfied. They're not going to stand down unless Trump stays in office. So I looked at it and said, well, impeach him. I don't know. Where do you stand now? Are you still a proponent for the impeachment and the
Not
conviction?
only impeachment, but to make sure he can't run again. I
Yeah,
mean, look, he's so dangerous that even like the Republican senators don't want him.
I
I mean,
know.
how much of a danger do you have to be for Mitch McConnell to be like, get out of here?
All right.
Mitch
Yeah.
McConnell,
Honest.
who would like, I think he would dig up a corpse from a graveyard and put it in a Senate seat if it would get him an extra vote. You know what I
Charles
mean?
Grassley from
Yeah,
Iowa.
put the strings on a corpse, just to get it to vote A on a tax break. So I'm just saying, if Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans are like enough, and 10 House Republicans said enough, that's already what you're seeing basically is that the Republican Party, or at least I would say the old guard of the Republican Party that pre-existed Trump, used Trump to get what they wanted most, which was their tax break, right? And that Trump riled up the Republican base in ways that they could use, but also in ways that they were not always comfortable with. And so now they're glad to get rid of him because the cost of Trump is at this point higher than the returns that they're getting from his presidency. And finally, just to make it very blunt, if you're an elected official and your president is calling for violence to be done unto politicians and for the overturning of elections, that means that you're at risk too. Because how did you get into office? An election.
Yes.
So if elections are now now if you open up the floodgates that we can just overturn elections via violence, what goes up can come down, and what goes one way goes the other way.
Exactly.
And so now you give legitimacy to left-wing violence to
Yes.
overturn elections. And so once that happens, this whole Democratic house of cards could easily fall because all of this is being held together by our belief in the legitimacy of institutions. And so once the right-wing mob, the insurrectionists trying to broke into the Capitol, they didn't just break into the Capitol, they also broke to an extent the legitimacy of the institution. And the Republicans need that legitimacy. And they need it for one very clear basic reason. The business Republicans represent a very wealthy minority, the business class. They represent a very wealthy, small few. And that business class has historically used right-wing ideology to solidify a Republican base that is conservative on all these issues and stitch that conservative base together and to use them to get the votes so that they can continue their corporate rule. That's basically it. And so now that rule can be shaken by a mob that rampages through the halls of power, that person who they use as a vehicle, Trump, the wheels have come off, and now they don't want him anymore. So I think the impeachment is necessary just from a Democratic standpoint, but I think it's pretty obvious that the Republican Party right now is deeply divided and deeply split between an old guard that really at least perceives its needs as part of the institution and the new guard that's willing, to be honest, to use violence or to at least condone it to get what they want. I think the thing that they miss, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, the thing that they miss is that, once you use violence, you get addicted to it. Once you use violence, it becomes a language that you become really easy to use, to speak in. And that means that all these questions that you would never have thought of using violence to answer, and that violence cannot really answer, now you answer it with violence. And the world begins to unravel. And once you use violence, that means you give the green light for other people to use violence. And no one is alone on this earth. There are a lot of people who don't agree with you. And if you're telling them that the only way that we can settle our disputes is through a gun or a knife or a bomb, the whole world goes up in flames. And so that's the kind of reality that I hope people listen to and they check and they're like, yeah, do you really want to live in a world of flames?
Oh, that's great. That guy can paint a word picture. I mean, that's what I've been trying to say, but I can't say it that eloquently. Well, we're running out of time here. And I wanted to get to one final thing. The Biden presidency, you're going to begin very shortly, obviously. Hopefully, we're going to have an inauguration and the Biden term is going to begin. Bernie Sanders, a guy that you and I had both supported, was being considered for labor secretary. That's not going to happen. He is going to get the head of the budget committee, very powerful Senate committee that can make some major changes. Where are you right now on Bernie? I got to tell you the truth. I got kind of disillusioned with Bernie and kind of reconciled myself, Nick, to the fact that Bernie is a pacifist. It's good news, bad news. I mean, I like pacifists. I hate war and violence, the things that you're talking about. The bad news is when push comes to shove, Bernie looks like he tends to get shoved a lot. What do you think going forward here is Bernie's role in bringing some change, which is really all he's talked about now for his entire tenure in the Senate?
Well, now that the Democrats have control of the Senate, however a slim majority it is, my thing is that Bernie has been championing these principles of free Medicare, Medicare for all, free college, lowering debt, and he's going to use his position as the chair of the Budgetary Committee to advance those as much as he can. I think that in the twilight of his life and of his political career, he wants to use this chance at real power to push through as many progressive policies as possible. I don't see this as an abdication of his principles or of his commitment to the people. I just think that he's saying this is the system that exists as it is, and let me work within it to try to give as much relief as he can to the people. And it's funny because it kind of cuts both ways. When Trump was trying to, and Trump has these populist impulses. So when they came at him with the $600 stimulus check, he's like, $600? Oh my God, I blow that in one night with a porn star. No, I 2,000, And Bernie was like, yes, give him 2,000. So what that tells me is that Bernie is always trying to get more money out of to the people. And I think he's, as the Budgetary Committee, we'll see what moves he makes. And that there is an ideal, that most people have of the kind of change that we need. And I agree that that's not just the ideal, it's what's needed for just human dignity. And then unfortunately, we have to live within these institutions. And so there's always this kind of back and forth, struggle. And that's where Bernie is at. So I will say this, that I think that the opening moves that I'm seeing from the Biden administration is that right now it's more important to get money in people's pockets and worry about the debt later. I think one of the upcoming crises in the next couple of years, after the pandemic really subsides, is the debt crisis. There's going to be a lot of people with a lot of debt, personal debt, business loan debt, student loan debt, and that debt is going to be exponential. So what we're really going to have to call on, which is a kind of universal class proposal, is a Jubilee year where we start to really cancel the debt. Now, what's dangerous and what's beautiful about that is that once you start canceling the debt and you realize that the sky doesn't fall and meteors aren't, crashing on Earth and cats and dogs aren't living together, right? Once you realize that you can cancel debt, people say, well, why couldn't we do this before? Why was I living every single day, working most of the hours to pay off debt from the past and not really able to live a decent life while I'm alive, while I'm breathing, while I'm here, my feet are on the ground? Why was I working so hard when we could have done this? And I think a very righteous anger will come up, because the minute you feel a little bit of relief and you realize that the sun still rises, then you begin to ask, well, why couldn't I get more relief and then more relief? And I hope that people take that urge, that righteous anger, and don't plug it into some stupid conspiracy theory, but plug it into actual, real, practical action that says we deserve more.
Yes. And beware the austerity movement, like you're talking about, because that's coming next. The Republicans are moving out of power here, and that's all you're going to hear. Now, you didn't hear about that when they were giving $5 trillion to the top 1% via the CARES Act. You didn't hear about that when the central bank out there in New York actually was pumping $1 trillion a day or a week or something like that, very quietly this past spring, into the banking system. You don't hear that when it comes to the oligarchy. We only hear it when it comes to suppressing the people and forcing us to get up and go to work tomorrow and feed that corporate corporate machine. So, I mean, to me, MMT, the modern monetary theory, which I barely understand, was proven correct by the CARES Act. And as Lee Camp, who I hope to have on my show, said in his recent book, that first audit, and you probably heard about it, Nick, of the Pentagon and HUD, I think, showed $21 trillion just missing off the books. I mean, there's all kinds of money out there, folks, and it's funny money. So there's no reason to hold the rest of us down like this and feel guilty because of what is benefiting the wealthiest in this country. Well, we got to run. We're out of time. We get two similar-minded folks on here like this, and it goes by very quickly. Nick, I want to give you the last words here in closing.
Yeah, we're in a situation where we have billions upon billions of dollars in, in guns and nuclear weapons and submarines, and
yes,
and at the same time we have in the same country people who are sleeping outside hungry and in the cold.
yes,
And and we're in a pandemic now where people who used to live in warm houses are now sleeping in their cars and traveling from one side of the horizon to the next, and not knowing where their life is going to end up. And that you as a human being deserve more. You deserve to be treated with love and respect and dignity. And your life is more important than money. And so we should act like that, both in our private lives and our political lives, and stop relying on conspiracy theories and dumb ideologies to guide us, and just simply ask, who around me has the least? What do they need, and how can we get it to them? And that's more important than any ideology. That impulse is probably what's going to save the day.
That's great, man. I couldn't be better on Martin Luther King Day. Folks, that's Nicholas Powers. He's a friend of the PBG. He's the author of The Ground Below Zero, 9/11 to Burning Man, New Orleans to Darfur, Haiti to Occupy Wall Street. It's published by Upset Press. You can get that on Amazon. Check it out. And, of course, he's an associate professor of English at the State University of New York, Old Westbury. Nick, thanks again for coming on a podcast by George.
Take care, George. Good seeing you.
Yeah, we'll circle back again very soon. And folks, if you enjoyed this episode, if you like podcasts by George, please, if you're watching on YouTube, like us and hit that subscribe bell there so that you continue to get notified of each and every episode as it releases. Like us on Facebook and follow us on iTunes and all the places that podcasts are seen or heard. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.